I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
I'm Paul Singer, Chairman of the Manhattan Institute. On behalf of the staff and trustees of the Institute, I welcome you to today's conference marking the 10th anniversary of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. In 2006, the Manhattan Institute sponsored a conference on the occasion of the 5th anniversary of 9/11 and devoted it to the role of law enforcement on the war on terror. It would be nice to think that we could someday stop doing this. It would be nice to think that someday we would no longer need to examine, as we're about to do, the challenges associated with policing terrorism, the evolving threat from homegrown plotters, or the necessary trade-offs between security and liberty. But that day, unfortunately, is not here. Until it comes, we must continue to mark these somber anniversaries. We must do so with reflection and reverence, of course, but also with a sense of purpose. By remembering the events of that terrible day, we honor the memory of those who died. By analyzing the changed world we now inhabit, we increase our capacity to analyze, identify, and disrupt future attacks. By applying the hard-won lessons of these last 10 years, we hasten the day when conferences like this will no longer be necessary. I expect we will all learn a great deal here today, not just about how far we've come, but the work left to do on the war on terror. We will hear from an unparalleled lineup of panelists, everyone from federal officials, such as former Attorney General Michael Mukasey and John Miller of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, to experts on local law enforcement, such as former Boston, LA, and New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton, former Miami Chief of Police John Timoney, New Jersey State Police Superintendent Rick Fuentes, and current NYPD Commissioner Ray Kelly. These are the foremost voices in the fields of homeland security, urban counterterrorism, and intelligence-led policing. These are people who have kept us safe and are keeping us safe, and the Manhattan Institute is honored to host them today. I'd like to note the Manhattan Institute's efforts in this field. Inside your folder is a short description of the Institute's work with the NYPD in the years right after 9/11. It's an excerpt from a forthcoming publication looking back at the many instances when the Institute took a hands-on approach to policy. I encourage you to read it. As their chairman, I'm proud of their efforts. Before we begin, I should say a word about how this all came about. Actually, I'll say two words: Judy Miller. Judy Miller is, as you know, one of the best-known journalists working on issues of counterterrorism and the need to balance our national security and our civil liberties in the post-9/11 world. Even while writing at her usual breakneck pace for City Journal, The Wall Street Journal, and other national publications, in between her appearances on Fox News programs such as The O'Reilly Factor and Hannity, Judy found the time to organize this landmark event. So on behalf of the Manhattan Institute, I thank you, Judy, for all of your, where is she? She was there. Ladies and gentlemen, Judy Miller.
Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you all very much for braving the elements to come. I now know what it takes to shut down New York City. A little rain. I have to say, having lived in Washington for many years, much better here than south of the Mason-Dixon line. New Yorkers are more intrepid. And speaking of intrepid New Yorkers, I want to introduce our first speaker this morning. Peter King, known to many in this room. is currently serving his 10th term in the U.S. House of Representatives, and he is here not only as a fellow New Yorker, but because he is chairman of the House Committee on Homeland Security. And in that capacity, he has held many groundbreaking hearings and helped pass much of the legislation that is helping to keep us safe. I don't want to spend his time talking to you about what he's done, but in particular, I just want to commend him for his brave decision to hold, finally, a hearing on domestic radicalization and the Islamic community. So, Congressman King, thank you very much for joining us, and I turn this morning's panel over to you.
Thank you very much, Judith. Thank you for inviting me here this morning, and let me commend the Manhattan Institute for the phenomenal job they do day in and day out, year in and year out, to really keep our country in the right direction and to keep us true to our values. And I particularly appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning as we enter the week preceding the 10th anniversary of September 11th, which had such a uniquely devastating impact on New York. It was an attack on the United States, but it was launched here in New York because New York really, in many ways, is the symbol of the United States, and to this day remains by far the #1 terrorist target in the country. I'm particularly honored to be here in a day where we have such outstanding leaders, those who are really fighting, have fought this struggle on the ground and continue to fight it. Commissioner Kelly from New York, Commissioner Bratton, Chief Timoney, so many others in this room, Chief Downing from LA, who was such a superb witness before our committee this year on the issue of prison radicalization, and so many of you who have dedicated so much of your time and effort to this issue. My remarks are not going to be long this morning, but let me just emphasize a few points, if I will. And I'm sure that the experts during the day will certainly expand on this. But the fact is that today we are, in many ways, much safer than we were prior to September 11th. It would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, for al-Qaeda to launch an attack similar to what they launched on September 11th, such a coordinated attack from outside the country. Today, it would, again, as I said, be virtually impossible to carry that out. There is too much coordination among our allies. There is too much coordination at the national level between our intelligence agencies and coordination with our federal, state, and local police for that to occur again. Now, the coordination is not perfect. A lot more has to be done, but as far as an external attack into the United States, it would be very difficult for al-Qaeda to carry anything out along the dimensions of September 11th. Having said that, al-Qaeda has adapted its strategy as well. As we've been able to prevent the outside attack, they have now changed their methods over the last 3, 4, 5 years, and they are attempting now to attack us from within by using people who are living here legally, who are under the radar screen, who have no particular known terrorist activities, inclinations, or associations. We've seen that here in New York with Najibullah Zazi in 2009, the attempted subway bomber. A person living here legally in this country, graduate of a Queens high school, actually had a hot dog stand in Lower Manhattan, no criminal record whatsoever, and yet he was being trained, he was recruited and taken to Afghanistan for training to come back and launch a liquid explosives attack in the New York City subway system on the September 11th weekend in 2009. And it was for a variety of reasons, many of the defenses set up after September 11th, that he was able to be stopped. One was his name appeared on a wiretap, an intercept, overseas intercept between known terrorists. Zazi's name happened to show up on that. Unfortunately, an analyst tracked it down, and we realized exactly what was involved, where he was coming from. And then we had the NYPD and the FBI working together to stop that attack against New York. But I remember being with Commissioner Kelly just really in the hours, days leading up to that, knowing how sensitive that was and how close that came to being a successful operation. Last year we had Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, a person who was not only living here legally, but he had become an American citizen. And yet he was being trained by the Pakistan Taliban to carry out attacks here in the United States, and he came very close to carrying out a very successful attack in Times Square. We have Major Hassan, who was recruited on the internet, who was a follower of Awlaki, who was head of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, And again, Major Hassan, who I believe should have been stopped, could have been stopped, but was not because of political correctness, but he stayed in the United States Army, went to Fort Hood, and murdered 13 Americans. He was a United States Army officer, a physician, a person who had all the benefits of this country and was living what appeared to be a very patriotic life to the outsider, and yet he carried out these brutal murders at Fort Hood of his fellow Americans. So that's the reality we face of an internal enemy, which, again, in some ways, the advantage is that these are not people who, for the most part, are receiving extensive training in Afghanistan the way the 9/11 hijackers did, which means that their level of skills may not be as great, but on the other hand, because they're under the radar screen, they have more opportunity to work within the country to carry out an attack. And that's the threat that we face today. And that's why it's so important that we have innovative thinking. One of the criticisms that was made of law enforcement at all levels right after September 11th was that it was too reactive, that it wasn't proactive enough, that it didn't reach out, that it didn't try to think outside the box. Well, the fact is, thank God, here in New York, that's exactly what Commissioner Kelly has done, thinking outside the box. And what he has done, as far as I see and what I know, being proactive, going out there, not waiting for the attack to happen, so then you can make arrests afterwards or you can pick up the bodies, but actually be proactive, going out, trying to find out where the threat is coming from and stop it before it occurs. And I can tell you, as the only member of Congress who's on the Homeland Security Committee and the Intelligence Committee, so I see the threats both from outside in and inside out. New York City and Long Island and Westchester County, the New York City region is by far the #1 terrorist target in this country. You know, they come up with different lists and different point systems, almost like the BCS. Well, unfortunately, you could have a separate list for New York all by itself, because the difference usually under these point systems between the #1 city, which is New York, and #2 is greater than between #2 and #20. I mean, New York is out there for every reason, whether it's because of the religious diversity, whether it's because of the landmarks we have, whether it's because we've been attacked before. We are the #1 target. And that's why it's so essential that we do have police work, which is not conventional police work, but police work that thinks outside the box, that tries to anticipate what the enemy is going to do and stop it before it happens, not, again, make the arrest afterwards. And that's why I find the attacks that are made on the NYPD to be totally without any basis at all, totally warrantless. And I can tell you, as a member of Congress, I will be always proud to stand with the NYPD and encourage other departments around the country to follow and doing what they're doing as far as being very proactive and stopping the threat before it occurs. Now, you're having this symposium today, this forum today, which shows how much you realize that we do face an ongoing threat from Islamic terrorism. Unfortunately, I find in other parts of the country, indeed in some parts of New York, certainly in Congress, the further you get from September 11th, the more it goes into the recesses of people's minds. And in some ways, we've been victims of our own success. Because there has not been a large-scale successful attack here in the United States in 10 years to too many people, this is something which is all in the past. Well, the fact is, it's as real as it's ever been. Secretary Napolitano and Mike Leiter, the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center, both have said that in many ways the threat level is greater now than it was on September 11th, because we're now facing an undercover enemy as opposed to one coming from overseas. And yet, at this time, where the threat is greater than it's been, where when bin Laden was killed and we went through his records, we saw that he wants to attack cities, he wants to attack mass transit. We find in Congress, both the House and the Senate are cutting the grants. I'm not talking about wasted money. I'm not talking about exotic programs. I'm talking about the programs, the grant money that goes directly to the police and firefighters on the front lines. That's being cut by almost 50% this year. Now, go to the NYPD, see the programs they have. How can we afford to cut them by 50%, our anti-terror programs, at a time when the terror threat is higher now than it was on September 11th? And again, it's more of an internal threat. I would say that police departments today need the training more now than they did prior to September 11th, because then, again, it was coming from the outside. Now we're talking about a threat from within our communities. And to be cutting funding at a time like this is irresponsible, it's wrong. Unfortunately, it's being done in a bipartisan way. And I would just hope that before these bills finally are signed into law, we can make some changes on it, some significant changes. Also, and I give the Department of Homeland Security credit for this. In the last time the funds were allocated, New York City did receive a greater share than it had gotten before, and that is a recognition, again, that we are the #1 terror target in the country. But if the pot keeps getting smaller, if the money keeps shrinking, no matter how it's allocated, it's not going to be enough. And this isn't pork barrel money. This isn't earmarks. We're talking about life and death issues. So I would really call upon all of you in this room, whatever influence you have with our opinion makers, with our leaders, to let them know the threat is real, and we still have to have that assistance from Washington. We're not looking for any kind of free meal here, but this is a combined effort that requires all levels of government to work together. You can't ask local police departments to be carrying out on their own what should be a national defense requirement. So thank you for having me here today. Thank really all the speakers who are here today. I know I just had a very interesting conversation with Brian Jenkins, who was convinced me that I'm never going to use the term lone wolf again. They're stray dogs. And he will discuss that. And because that's what you hear people talk about a lone wolf, it has a certain exotic flavor to it. The fact is, these are stray dogs. They're murderers, they're killers, they're butchers, and that's why we have to do all we can to stop them and to fight them. So thanks for having me, and have a great forum. I have to go back to Washington and do the nation's business, so you can boo me if you want to. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Raymond, president of the Manhattan Institute. It is my pleasure this morning to introduce our keynote speaker, Police Commissioner of the City of New York, Ray Kelly. Ray Kelly grew up on the west side of Manhattan and joined the police department in 1963. But before really getting started in the job, he did a typical Ray Kelly thing. He joined the Marines. After 3 years of active military service, including a combat tour in Vietnam, he returned to the NYPD and began what can only be described as one of the most successful careers ever in the history of American law enforcement. Versed in his police academy class, Kelly served in 25 different commands before being named the city's 37th commissioner in 1992. From 1996 to 1998, he served as Undersecretary for Enforcement at the United States Department of the Treasury, where his purview included oversight of the Customs Service, the Secret Service, and the ATF. From 1998 to 2001, he served as Commissioner of the U.S. Customs Service. In 2002, shortly after the terror attacks of 9/11, he returned to New York as the city's 41st police commissioner. I think it is safe to say that in the intervening years, no one, and I mean no one, has done more to keep New York City safe from another terrorist attack than Ray Kelly. Even before taking office, he saw the need to recalibrate the police department by establishing a counterterrorism division. The Manhattan Institute was proud to collaborate with the NYPD in those crucial early years after 9/11. Our Center for Tactical Counterterrorism worked very closely with the Commissioner and his deputies to establish and expand an intelligence analysis capacity within the department. We even donated one of our brightest young minds to that effort, Pete Patton, who made the leap from a Manhattan Institute analyst to the NYPD in 2004 and works in the Counterterrorism Division to this day. Commissioner Kelly is a graduate of Archbishop Molloy High School, and if you've ever been in the visiting locker room there, they have all the trophies to psych you out, and believe me, it works. I've been there. From there, he went to Manhattan College in the Bronx, St. John's University in Queens, New York University School of Law in Manhattan, and the JFK School of Government at Harvard University. In 2006, he was awarded France's highest decoration by the then Minister of the Interior and current French President Nicolas Sarkozy. And in 2010, he was awarded the highest honor for an Irish American when he was named Grand Marshal of the New York City St. Patrick's Day Parade. The Manhattan Institute was very pleased to have honored him twice, first with the 2005 Urban Innovator Award, and again in 2009 with the Alexander Hamilton Award. On behalf of the Manhattan Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome New York City Police Commissioner Ray Kelly.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Larry, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank Judy Miller for bringing us all together. And I want to thank Judy for her outstanding reporting on some of the most challenging issues of our day. And of course, I want to thank the Manhattan Institute for hosting this forum and for supporting the New York City Police Department, certainly for this last 10 years, but for long before that. And Peter has left, but New York has no better friend in Washington, no fiercer advocate, and no one more knowledgeable about the important issues of Homeland Security than Peter King. No question about it, he has argued very effectively for New York City. Although Peter represents Nassau County, he is, I would say, our strongest advocate in Washington, and I want to, if you were here, thank him in person, but I've thanked him many times for the great work that he's done for the New York City Police Department and for New York City. Before I talk about the New York City Police Department and how it's changed since 9/11 and how we assess the threat going forward, I want to give you some insight into our plans over the next few days leading up to the 10th anniversary of September 11th. While no one has uncovered a specific plot, documents found in Osama bin Laden's compound after his death speak to al-Qaeda's aspirations to carry out an attack on this date. For that reason, we need to take precautions as if an actual plot were underway. We're staffing up for the arrival of President Obama and former President George W. Bush, who will appear together at the World Trade Center site. We're creating a large frozen zone around the site from West Street to Broadway and Murray Street to Albany Street. We'll have thousands of extra officers on duty that day and some of the days before. They'll include officers with radiation detection equipment, counter-snipers, bomb technicians, scuba divers, helicopter pilots, and a host of other specialized teams. From our Lower Manhattan Security Coordination Center, we'll be monitoring license plate readers and hundreds of cameras trained on the World Trade Center site. We don't presume that Ground Zero alone is the potential target. That would be short-sighted. We'll be staging quick reaction forces outside of Lower Manhattan to respond to any emergency. It will include heavily armed emergency service officers and detectives from our Organized Crime Control Bureau, where we trained officers in heavy weapons after the attacks in Mumbai. They serve as a supplemental reserve for our emergency service officers. Bomb squad officers and hostage negotiators will also be attached to these quick reaction groups, as will highway patrol officers, to ensure that these teams can get to any point in the city as quickly as possible. We're adding extra layers of coverage throughout the subway system. And on Friday, we'll have a major deployment of officers at Grand Central, Penn Station, and the Herald Square Station. This is part of a regional exercise in which police agencies all along Amtrak's Northeast Corridor will assign extra police to their mass transit systems. That afternoon, we'll also conduct a conference call with our partners from the Securing the Cities initiative. That's a DHS-funded program with 150 regional law enforcement agencies designed to deter a nuclear or dirty bomb attack. We'll also engage our partners from Operation Sentry, a network of 100 police departments throughout the Northeast. Later on today, we'll have a conference at police headquarters with our NYPD SHIELD partners, which is a grouping of 8,000 security directors in the metropolitan area. We have a large detail of officers assigned to the U.S. Open tennis tournament in Flushing, Queens, which is ongoing. The men's final will be played there on September 11th. Tomorrow, the USS New York, a Navy warship constructed of steel from the World Trade Center, is docking at Pier 88 on West 48th Street. NYPD scuba divers will examine the pier for explosives below the waterline. The opening of the New York Stock Exchange on Friday will attract dignitaries, including Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, whose protection involves NYPD resources. Throughout the weekend, we'll be covering more than 30 other 9/11 commemorative events. We're also well into the intensive planning required for the United Nations General Assembly. That convenes next week with the arrival of 130 heads of state. And obviously, a critical vote on Palestinian, I should say, statehood is on the agenda, and we anticipate several demonstrations related to that vote. And 220 motorcades to be coordinated by the NYPD and the Secret Service. In other words, we have a lot on our plate. But we have the talent and we have the resources to deal with it. Over the next few days, we'll continue to receive and analyze the stream of intelligence from our federal partners and from overseas. I can assure you nobody is sitting on information these days. If they have it, they share it. The police department is accustomed to dealing with the confluence of big events. But in the area of global terrorism, a meeting of the UN or a concert in Central Park takes a special significance and concern. It means that in addition to fighting crime, we have to factor counterterrorism into everything that we do. September 11th forever changed how the NYPD views its mission and the world around us. As soon as the Bloomberg administration took office, we quickly reorganized our operations to address the threat of terrorism. We could not defer this responsibility to others. Now, I know many of you are familiar with what we've done, but I think some of these initiatives bear repeating. We immediately increased the number of detectives assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force with the FBI. On September 11th, there were just 17 detectives serving on New York City's JTTF. We increased that number to more than 120. Since that time, the JTTF has functioned as our chief conduit for receiving intelligence developed overseas about terrorist plots related to New York. We've had excellent cooperation with the FBI. Director Robert Mueller has been an important and vocal supporter. We've also benefited greatly from having several former FBI executives serving in the ranks of our intelligence division. They include the NYPD's Assistant Commissioner of Programs, Sid Casperson, who held the senior executive post in the FBI's New York field office prior to joining us, and was also Director of Homeland Security for the state of New Jersey. The Director of our International Liaison Program, Ed Curran, who served previously as an FBI Senior Executive Service Officer and Director of Counterintelligence at the Department of Energy. And the NYPD's former Director of Surveillance Training, Bill Weiskopf, who before coming to the department was the FBI's premier expert in this field. In 2002, in addition to strengthening our federal partnerships, we became the first police department in the country to put in place our own counterterrorism bureau. We established a division within the bureau, responsible for training and equipping all of our 35,000 police officers for counterterrorism duties, and a medical team to assess new threats to the city. We've competed, I should say, with the State Department and others to attract Ivy League trained analysts with international expertise to our counterterrorism and intelligence divisions. We've also turned to experts with deep federal and international experience. Leaders like Marine Lieutenant General Frank Labuti, who once commanded all the Marines in the Pacific Theater, Mike Sheehan, who on the panel, will be on a panel today, a former Special Forces commander and ambassador at large for counterterrorism under President Bill Clinton. Richard Falkenrath, one of the architects of the Department of Homeland Security under President George W. Bush, and Richard D'Addario, who served as the Department of Justice's attaché in Moscow and as chief of the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office for 14 years, supervising and prosecuting international terrorism cases. To head our restructured intelligence division, we recruited David Cohn. David, a 35-year veteran of the CIA, who led both the operational and analytical arms of the agency. Now, our intelligence gathering is greatly supported by the senior officers that we've assigned as liaisons to police and intelligence agencies in 11 cities around the world. From these locations, our liaisons can easily travel to the scenes of terrorist attacks that occur throughout Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. They seek to learn practical lessons from terrorism-related events. With every major attack or conspiracy, we want to know the specific tactics that were used, the type of weaponry and explosives involved, where the planning was conducted, and the nature of the targets. We want all of our liaisons to ask themselves the New York question. How can the lessons learned from the attack be applied here in New York City? How can it make New York City safer? In some cities, our work has been supported by having liaisons fluent in the languages of the countries where they're serving. The NYPD is fortunate to have a deep pool of bilingual officers. This is a result of the remarkable diversity that we now have in our ranks. Since 2002, we have made a concerted effort to tap into this resource by recruiting more officers from minority and immigrant communities. Whereas the uniform ranks of the NYPD were once composed primarily of white officers, today our recruit classes are typically majority-minority. That is, more African American, Hispanic, and Asian officers than white officers. In 2006, for the first time, the rank of police officer became majority-minority. Since that time, we've hired officers born in 88 different countries, representing dozens of ethnicities, nationalities, and faiths. In addition to helping us work well with the communities that we serve, this emphasis on diversity has resulted in the NYPD having more foreign language speakers than any other police department anywhere. They include thousands of Spanish-speaking officers, as well as speakers of Arabic, Urdu, Pashto, Farsi, Bengali, Russian, Mandarin, to name just a few of the 60 languages in total in which the department officers are fluent. Now, the death of Osama bin Laden, as welcome as it is to all New Yorkers, was a success with complications. We have to assume there are bin Laden disciples who would like nothing better than to avenge his death by striking New York City one more time. We're keeping a 360-degree perspective by continuing to monitor Al-Qaeda Central, by watching for web-indoctrinated lone wolves, and by the emerging threat to the West and to New York City by Al-Qaeda's web of regional affiliates, from Yemen-based Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to Al-Shabaab in Somalia to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in North Africa, and the Nigerian Islamic radicals with ties to Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram. Our intelligence division, with its deep bench of foreign language speakers, is tracking how anyone associated with these groups or others would enter New York and how they would communicate and conceal themselves here. If they entered via Canada, at which land crossing? What internet cafe in which borough would they be likely to use? At which SRO would they find lodging? Establishing this kind of knowledge base to alert us to a terrorist presence in the New York metropolitan area takes a concerted effort on our part. And it's one that we must sustain, despite having 6,000 fewer officers in our ranks than we had in 2001. The price to pay otherwise is too great to bear. We've also benefited greatly from a federal judge's decision to modify a decades-old court ruling known as the Hanshu Consent Decree that hampered our ability to investigate potential terrorist activity. Now we can do that far more effectively. We'll continue to train, recruit, and closely supervise undercover officers in order to infiltrate a terrorist cell before it has a chance to reach maturity and kill New Yorkers. Would we put an undercover officer in an Islamic bookstore? Yes, if that's what was required to defeat a homegrown terrorist like Mateen Siraj from plotting to bomb the Herald Square subway station. Might an NYPD undercover officer travel to New Jersey? Yes, if that's what it took to keep track of al-Qaeda sympathizers like Carlos Almonte and Mohammed Alessa, who were determined to receive terrorist training abroad only to return home to kill us here. Would we have an undercover or a confidential informant get close to a fellow New Yorker? Yes. If that's what New Yorkers, if that New Yorker was someone like Ahmed Farani, who pledged to, quote, blow up a synagogue in Manhattan and take out the whole entire building. Would we use a confidential informant to help upstate police bring 3 suspects in a white supremacist group to justice? Yes, if they were plotting to attack the U.S. Army's Waterville arsenal with homemade explosives. Now, these were all instances in which undercover officers and confidential sources developed by the NYPD's Intelligence Division stopped dangerous individuals in their tracks. Will we continue to deploy officers in places like Amman, Jordan, Abu Dhabi, Montreal, Toronto, Paris, Lyon, Santo Domingo, Madrid, London? Yes, and in other places too. If only to give us a few time zones worth of preparation to protect the New York City subway system from the kind of attacks that we've seen abroad. We'll also continue to staff at robust levels the Joint Terrorism Task Force with the FBI, and we'll preserve our relationship with the CIA to learn everything we can about foreign enemies who may want to kill New Yorkers. Now, tomorrow morning, I'll address the surviving family members of the 23 police officers killed on September 11th and the 50 more who died of 9/11 related respiratory illnesses in the years afterward. I can assure you that I will tell them that the NYPD is in this fight for the long haul and that we'll do everything lawfully in our power to make sure their loved ones did not die in vain. I'm convinced the vast majority of New Yorkers, and Americans for that matter, understand and appreciate why and what the New York City Police Department is doing to keep the nation's most important city safe. Nonetheless, we've needed allies. So I want to thank the Manhattan Institute for bringing your intellectual firepower to the fight. You were there early, and you were there often, and you were unwavering. So thank you for all that you do, and keep up the great work, and thank you for inviting me this morning.
I want to thank you very much for all that you do and for your terrific speech, which was filled with things that actually I did not know, and rationales for conduct and activities that the police carry out every day on behalf of New Yorkers that I think required and needed fuller explanation than we've had to date. So I thank you for that. I want to take you back, sir, to September 11th, 2001, which the 9/11 Commission reminds us, a still gripping document to read, which is now out in a new edition, was a cloudless, beautiful, crystal clear day in New York. And I know that you were not in law enforcement then, but where were you? Were you chomping at the bit not to be in the part of the law enforcement community? Where were you? What were you thinking about what was happening in our city?
I wasn't chomping at the bit. I was happily ensconced in Bear Stearns, making a few dollars. And it was a beautiful morning, you're right. I was having breakfast in the Bear Stearns executive dining room with some people, and we were told that a small plane hit the World Trade Center, and that would seem to be an accident. And then as we walked into the office complex, we heard another plane had hit, and obviously it was a terrorist attack. So I went to a new building that Bear Stearns was building just a block away, went up to the highest floor I could go to. Some people were said to be panicking over there, so I tried to calm them down, but I went up to the highest floor and saw the first building fall. Of course, it's a sight indelibly imprinted in my mind, and it brought back to me, right then, I've told the story before, about February 26, 1993, when I was the police commissioner then, and it was the time of the first World Trade Center attack. It was about 10 o'clock at night. I was sitting in the lobby basement. That attack had resulted in a bombing, a huge hole, crater, from the B1 to the B5 level in the building, and sitting with engineers, one of which had just cut himself out of an elevator with a key. And we were talking about the possibility of one building being knocked into the other, which it turned out that it was in the minds of the terrorists. And the discussion was these buildings could never come down. No way you could ever take buildings constructed like this. We've seen these huge beams in the basement. And that struck me. It's like, how could this happen? And I must say, I thought that the casualty count would have been even greater than it was. See that building fall, and of course the next building fell just a half hour later. So it was, and I really had really not a desire to go back into government, but I must say that the events of September 11th sort of made me feel helpless. I was on the sidelines. I wanted to get back in the game. Yes.
Didn't you also have to move out of Battery Park City at
yeah,
that point?
my house, the apartment I live in and still live in, a block and a half away from the World Trade Center site. It was really our neighborhood. That's where we shopped, and my wife happened to be out of the country at the time, but we were out of the apartment for over 2 months and living in a variety of places. So it certainly impacted on us that way, but we were very fortunate.
Did you think about that when you ordered the evacuation of Battery Park City very recently because of a non-terrorism related event?
I evacuated Battery Park City last week based on the orders of the mayor, and got a lot of dirty looks from people down there, but it was the right thing to do in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. It's now 10 years later, and you discuss the many measures that the NYPD has taken to make us safer. But I guess a question I have as someone who covers terrorism and wrestles with it is, how do you measure how much safer we are? Is it just a question of nothing's happened? I mean, might that have happened, not been the outcome if we hadn't spent these billions of dollars that you're spending and devoted the additional resources to this problem? I mean, how do you measure the extent to which your dollars
I guess the answer is maybe. But I think that is the most significant metric, the fact that we haven't been attacked. And we said we have 13 plots in this city, and it's a combination of good work by the federal government, good work by NYPD officers, luck, all came together to prevent an attack from happening in New York City. And I'll take that any time. Yeah, you could speculate, hey, nothing would have happened. And it's always interesting. The media always seems to look at, after an arrest is made, they poo-poo it. It's, oh, these people were so inept, they never could have carried it off. And of course, if anything did happen, it would be just the reverse. You know, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? So I'd much rather be on the safe side of spending money. I think, you know, we've done good work here collectively. It's certainly not alone. We're in partnership. I mentioned in my prepared remarks that we have an organization of over 100 law enforcement agencies in the northeast part of the country. We're working with 150, some of the same organizations, in our Securing the Cities initiative to prevent a radiological attack here. So we're not doing it alone by any means, but through a lot of hard work and a lot of effort on the part of multiple agencies, federal, state, and local, we haven't been attacked. And let me say this, it is the last decade, the last 10 years, is the only one of the last 4 decades in which New York City hasn't had a terrorist attack. You had them in the 70s, we had them in the 80s, we had them in the 90s, but we haven't had one terrorist attack here in New York City in the last 10 years. I'll take it.
Do you think if something were to happen, the NYPD has done all that it can do to instill a kind of, shall we say, Israeli-like resiliency among New Yorkers? Is there more you can do in that area?
In terms of making New Yorkers resilient?
Yes.
Well, I think New Yorkers have become complacent. It's not necessarily a bad thing. We want people to get on with their lives, but you know, in Israel, and we have our officers stationed there, you know, when something does happen, and thank God it's happened with a lot less frequency, but Israelis are very stoic. They clean up, and an hour later, 2 hours later, they're back in business. I don't think New York is there, quite frankly. I think if we had, for instance, Najibullah Zazi and his 2 partners blow themselves up on rush hour trains, rush hour subway trains, that was their plan, do it on September 14th of 2009, that New York and New Yorkers would not have responded particularly well. I don't know who was getting on the subway the next day. This is not Israel, you know, where they've learned their lessons the hard way. So I think New Yorkers have gotten complacent, and I'm not certain we can do that much more about it.
Which of the variety of threats that the city faces from terrorists worries you the most? Is it biological? Is it nuclear? Is it a Mumbai-style attack? What keeps you awake at night?
We worry about all of them. Obviously, the one with the least probability but the greatest impact would be a radiological nuclear event. But we have to think about it. We are paid to think about these unthinkable thoughts, and it would be obviously catastrophic, or a dirty bomb would potentially limit our use of a particular area for perhaps years to come, depending on the amount of radiological material used. Mumbai-style attacks, it certainly got our attention. We sent our liaison officers there. They were there literally hours after the shooting stopped. And we saw how easy it was to conduct an attack. These individuals had semi-automatic AK-47 rifles. They each had 300 rounds of ammunition. They had hand grenades. They had bombs. Yet they killed and wounded almost 500 people. They initially started taking hostages, and then they stopped taking hostages. So we looked at that, and we said, and we had 5 days later, we had our own tabletop exercise here. We had an actual exercise at Floyd Bennett Field, which we watched on our television screens. We had our emergency service officers respond. And one of the lessons we took away from Mumbai was that in a protracted situation similar to that, we may not have enough officers trained to deal with a heavy weapons situation. We have our prime cadre for that as emergency service officers, highly trained. They're emergency medical technicians, emergency psychological technicians trained in heavy weapons. What we did was take members of the Organized Crime Control Bureau, Narcotics Division, and other investigators, about 250 of them, and train them in heavy weapons and some of the tactics that the emergency service officers get. And we use them as a reserve force, which I mentioned in my prepared remarks. We use them to buttress emergency service officers in a protracted type hostage-taking situation, because we have to police the rest of the city. What we also did was film the interior locations of all the major hotels, certainly in Midtown, but now we've done virtually all hotels in New York. We use that as a training device for police officers, locally assigned police officers, and emergency service police officers. If we respond to a hotel, where are the key locations? What does a standard room look like? That sort of thing. So those are some of the things we took away from Mumbai. And an attack like that obviously gave us and gives us cause for concern, because it's relatively easy to do.
Has the NYPD been shortchanged by the government? We heard Pete King talk about a 50% cut in counterterrorism funds. How is that impacting you?
That would impact us significantly. We're concerned about it. Peter King, as I said, has been our staunchest advocate in that regard. But I can't say that we have been shortchanged in the last few years. We've done okay. I think initially we were. You know, in Washington, all politics is local. Everybody's taking care of their own districts. They have the wildest, rationale for why money goes to Podunk, and not coming to New York City. Yet they'll tell you privately that, yes, we know New York is the #1 target, and we know that if something happens in New York, it's going to reverberate throughout the world, throughout the country. But I can't say that we've been shortchanged. Would we like more money? Yes. I'd like to see money for personnel. It's something that the federal government is just not going to do. As I said, we're down 6,000 police officers. That is a tremendous hit, because you heard how many things we have on our agenda just in the next few weeks. But that's life in New York City. We keep having these type of events. Do we need more personnel? Yes. Are we going to get them out of city funds? No, we're not. We know what the economic climate is like.
Do you anticipate more cuts in your force?
I'm hopeful that we'll be able to maintain the level where we are. The mayor realizes this. He clearly does. Made a lot of governmental sacrifices to see that we're able to hire a class in July. We hired 1,600 police officers, which is a big number for us, and it's a heavy lift for the city. But the mayor clearly realized that we needed it. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to maintain the level that we're at now, which is roughly 35,000. We attrit officers out every day, but that's sort of like the mean number that I'd like to stay. Actually, it'll be below that. The yearly average will be below 35,000.
Are you negotiating with the police union to try and get some concessions for them as we look ahead at the budgetary pressures that are building?
I don't do the negotiations. In the city, there is a labor negotiation.
Do you think that has to happen?
I'm sorry?
Does that have to happen? Does the police union have to make some concessions?
I'd like to see it, but I'm not holding my breath.
And you're not counting on it in terms of your budgetary assumptions about how much money you're going to have to work with in the city?
No, we don't.
Okay. I want to go to the questions raised by the AP story and Len Levitt in NYPD Confidential, because at least one congresswoman has called for an investigation of, and she sits on the House Homeland Security Committee. This is Yvette Clarke, saying that she's very worried about the relationship between the Muslim community, which every independent study tells us is vital to the protection of the city, that your police force depends largely and heavily on tips from this community, and that it's terrible to alienate them. And many of the questions that are raised by the AP story do raise some concerns about your relationship with the Muslim community. Do you routinely infiltrate mosques, as the AP reported?
No, the answer is no. But let me talk about a relationship with the Muslim community. We have a very strong relationship with the Muslim community in this city. We have increased the number of Muslim officers significantly. We have two fraternal organizations. You can't ask anyone their religion. We don't ask them, but I sanctioned the Muslim Officers Association and also a DC association, which is a South Asian group. So we have, I'll estimate we probably have 400 Muslim officers in the department. I go to mosques on a regular basis and interact with people. I hold sort of town hall meetings and answer questions. We have just had Ramadan has ended, but we've had a pre-Ramadan conference in police headquarters. We had 500 people there. We do that every year. I think if you ask members of the Muslim community in general in New York City about our relationship, it's a strong one. Now, you talk about infiltrating mosques. We follow leads wherever those leads take us. If the leads happen to take us to a religious institution, we're not going to be deterred because it's a religious institution. But we don't. There was an expression in the article about mosque crawlers I never heard that term. Somebody made that up. I don't know.
There are
where
no
they get
moss
it.
crawlers, there are no rakers, as they're called in the NYPD
I think
story.
raker is an expression for the analysts that we have. I've heard that expression, but not moss
But not
crawler
moss
is not. No,
crawlers.
we don't do that, and we don't use that expression.
A document from the NYPD in 2006 was published by Lenny Levitt. It said that the NYPD's spying operation had compiled information on 250 mosques, 12 Islamic schools, 31 Muslim student associations, 263 places you called ethnic hotspots. Those are the language from the NYPD document. And that you've singled out 53 mosques for 4 Islamic schools, 7 Muslim student associations as institutions of concern, and have labeled 42 persons at that time as top-tier persons of interest. Do you think this kind of activity is excessive? Does this not suggest that the Muslim
First of all,
community is being targeted?
I question the
Is
validity of
that
those
document
numbers, but
valid? Is it a real
Are we
NYPD
gathering
document?
information
Yes.
about demographics of New York City?
Yes.
Yes. We'd be foolhardy not to. We live in the most diverse city in the world. We get information that somebody's coming from Pakistan that wants to attack us. Don't you think we'd like to know where that person might go, what hotels they might use, or what community they may resurface in? Yeah, we are creating, and we have what we call zone assessment teams that go out and look at areas in the city, and may include mosques, it may include hotels, it may also include businesses that are unwittingly used or could be used by terrorists. We do that through our Nexus unit. So I think what you see here is a sort of a combination. It's sort of half-truths. It is mixing of different programs that we have. I also want to point out, and I mentioned it before, that the Handschuh Amendment has given us the ability to conduct investigations in a very structured manner, to follow leads wherever those leads take us. It follows the FBI guidelines, and we are able to look for leads. We can do preliminary inquiries, we can do full-blown investigations, and we can do enterprise terrorist investigations. They require investigative statements that are made. We have an internal committee that looks at all of this work. The committee is made up of our Deputy Commissioner of Legal Matters, a Harvard Law graduate, a law professor at NYU for 25 years. We have former U.S. attorneys that work for us. We have attorneys embedded in the intelligence division. We're very conscious as to making certain we adhere to constitutional provisions. We know that we're going to be looked at and scrutinized. So we are very careful in what we do in these investigations. I think what you see here is sort of an amalgam of everything thrown together. And again, I question those numbers. But we live in a world of WikiLeaks. We live in the world of disgruntled employees that are gathering real or imagined information and putting it out. This is not going to deter us, by the way. We are going to continue to do what we believe needs to be done to protect the city.
And the mayor, I believe, has issued a statement of support.
The mayor's been very supportive,
Has
absolutely.
anyone else in Washington expressed support for
Anyone
your
else in Washington?
activities? Yes.
John Brennan, the President Obama's counterterrorism advisor, has been very supportive. John, we'll be seeing John this weekend. He has been very supportive. Vocally, he's spoken to our executive corps. So, yeah, I think we have support in the right places.
To prevent flash mobs, the City Council of Cleveland passed legislation that was intended to bar the improper use of social media to violate ordinances on disorderly conduct, public intoxication, and unlawful congregation. and to prevent illegal flash mob activity. The mayor vetoed the city council's Flash Mob Prevention Act on grounds that it was so sweeping that it would limit the behavior of people who had done nothing wrong at all. And David Cameron of Britain, who was considering similar restrictions on the use of social media, has also abandoned that. Do you consider such restrictions on the use of social media appropriate? And that's a question that Floyd Abrams asked today in the Wall Street Journal. Where do you draw the line between what is appropriate to protect society and the protection of civil liberties?
Well,
what is unacceptable behavior on the part of the police?
I don't think that legislation is needed. When,
you wouldn't consider anything like that for
not.
New
I think
York?
we are aware of that potential, and you're talking about Cleveland now, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it hasn't been proposed here.
No.
We actually use social media. Certainly, Twitter is something that we find helpful.
You monitor Twitter?
Sure, absolutely. Okay. There's a site, Monitor is called, that you can, it helps you monitor Twitter. These are, statements in the messaging in a public domain. There's nothing inappropriate with that.
Just a couple more questions. Do you think what you've built here, the counterterrorism structure that you've built, could withstand your departure? What happens in the years out? Is this structure going to continue? Will the counterterrorism mission continue?
A new mayor, a new police commissioner obviously can set their own priorities. I think common sense would dictate that if you are charged with the obligation of protecting the world's most important city, you've got to keep in place a robust counterterrorism effort. This is where they want to go. This is the communications capital, the financial capital of the world. This is where the terrorists want to make their statement. This is the world's biggest stage, and you have to factor that in any law enforcement or a counterterrorism regimen that you put in place.
And a final question that I'm sure everyone in this room wants to know, and that is, what are your future plans? Are you going to rule out or endorse the rumors we've heard about you considering becoming our next mayor?
I have no plans to run for elective office. Believe me, this is a full-time job. It's a total immersion job, and I'm fully engaged in it. But
thank you very much, Commissioner Kelly.
Thank you.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.